All right, I have 4 o'clock, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Once again, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today and joining us for talking about Washington's unique tax system. My name is Amy Cleaver. I am here from the Financial Education Public Private Partnership. It's so nice to be here with you this afternoon. And I am joined by Bobby deGrouchy from the Clover Park School District as our guest speaker today. And he will introduce himself in just a moment. All right. So if you have not already, please do sign in with your name and school or district in the chat. That will be our first step to getting you the clock hours that you deserve for being here. After this PD, you will receive an email from PD Enroller, that email survey where you will rate and evaluate the training. And that is how you will receive the clock hours. And Linda, is there anything you would like to add for that? Linda is our clock hour guru here at FEPP.
No, I believe that's everything. I will probably take attendance tomorrow on everybody that was there and get all those in there. So once I take attendance, that will send the email to each participant.
Fantastic. Thank you. We will make sure that you get these slides, this slide deck, as well as the many sources that we reference in this slide deck are also going to be made available for you. Linda uploads those to PD Enroller, and we have PDF versions available as well. If you are safely able to do so, we do appreciate when you turn your camera on. It's always nicer, as you know, to look at faces when you're presenting. Yeah, we just appreciate that engagement. And if you are safely able to, I do have a couple quiz questions in our welcome activity to see what we can know or guess about state taxes. And during this presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them down in the chat. During each of our presentations, or sections, we will be taking note of the questions and making sure that we either can answer them in the moment or circle back to answer them towards the end. So, and please note that AI chatbots are not permitted to attend our webinars. All right, and I would love to start with a land acknowledgement. I am joining you from the land of the Spokane people, and we use this map from native-land.ca in order to recognize just the sovereignty of all Indigenous nations, their lands, and their waters. I love that native-land.ca as a resource uh, states that they recognize that these boundaries and territories are representations of the sacred. They represent the rights of Indigenous data sovereignty and are committed to an ongoing process of collaboration, growth, and learning, working to update and replace information that is a continuation of trauma caused by theft, injustice, misinformation, and ignorance. So the map is a living document informed by the contributions of Indigenous communities, Indigenous knowledge holders, and their stories. It's an honoring of Indigenous resilience, past, present, and future. Okay, and I'll take just a moment to introduce myself as well. Hello, my name is Amy Cleaver. As I mentioned, I am honored to serve as the K-8 program supervisor at the Financial Education Public-Private Partnership, which I will explain in detail in just a few moments. I was born and raised in the Pacific Northwest. As I mentioned, I am joining you from Spokane, Washington. I moved back to the area a few years ago after spending a good amount of time in Glendale, Arizona, where I did the majority of my classroom teaching experience with fifth graders, seventh grade, math, social studies, social emotional learning, as well as I think 7 years of peer-to-peer instructional coaching. So I will reference Glendale quite a bit when we start talking about how we can start bring some of these state tax information to our students and applications for where it will appear in our lives. I also just like to mention that I am a financial wellness work in progress. Here at FEPP, we view financial wellness as the goal of financial education, viewing our personal finance as a component of our physical, social, emotional, mental well being, and seeing that it touches those parts of our lives. So we aim to just make wellness, that part, our financial wellness, a part of it when we consider, self care as well. And I would like to turn it over to Bobby to introduce himself now. Bobby,
Hey everybody, my name is Bobby deGrouchy, and um, we haven't updated my picture in quite some time. My wife would
we
definitely want me
haven't.
to do that. That's okay, maybe. I'm a school teacher in the Clover Park School District. I teach at Hetloff Middle School. I've been a teacher for going on 20 years. In addition to that, I'm here today talking to you guys because I am the middle school representative on the state education committee, or on the executive committee. I'm the co-chair of financial education in the state of Washington of the education committee. I'm a FEPPP Fellow, and I'm currently doing my doctorate at Wazoo. Go Cougs! I have been teaching financial education for a long time, but I'm a teacher just like many of you guys here. It was really nice to see everything here. I'm on spring break right now, which is nice. If you guys are in spring break, thanks for showing up today. And I'm going to give you as much background as I can into how we um, use this information with our kids and working into our frameworks and just kind of integrate it into those other pieces. And Amy's also going to give you some great material that you can use in your classroom. So thanks for being here today.
Bobby, before you, oh, you're already
Oh, go ahead.
muted, but can you remind me again about the details about your doctorate?
Sure. Yeah, I'm getting my doctorate in ed leadership. My focus is on policy and well, in particular, my focus is on how we're. If you guys didn't know, we're doing this financial education thing here in Washington State, and we haven't fully integrated it yet. You can feel different ways about a variety of different things, the way different pathways for a graduation requirement, how we integrate it. So I'm looking at what we're doing here in Washington and being a part of FEPP as a teacher for the last golly, it's 225. We're going on like 6 or 7 years. Um, how we have focused on its implementation and really not just putting it, well, I'll tell you this. I try not to give too many viewpoints, but we're not trying to not just put a graduation requirement out there that doesn't do anything. You guys already know that. If you're a high school teacher, I taught high school, like what are the steps that we're taking here? How do we follow research practices? But that's what my dissertation is focusing on. And in particular, I'm focusing on the work that we're doing in to serve American Indian and Alaska Native students.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bobby. All right. So a little background about FEPP, the Financial Education Public-Private Partnership. And just so you know, we go by FEPP. I did have a meeting with somebody today who was referring to us as the FEPP, which was very charming, but unnecessary. Just FEPP is easy. We were established in 2004 by our Washington State legislature. Like Bobby mentioned, Washington State has been investing in the financial education in our public school system for quite a while, and we have been ahead of the curve, what is a national trend right now in integrating financial education into schools and curriculums. So we expanded around 2022, and we have our responsibilities. We review financial education instructional materials across K-12. We have developed a robust clearinghouse of these resources on our website, www.fepp.org. And we provide professional development and training opportunities like the one you are attending today at no cost. All of this in the pursuit of our overarching goal, which is to advance high quality, diverse financial education in our public school system. Like I said, we want to do that by serving teachers because we recognize that there is a foundation of information that is needed if we are going to ask educators to take this on as a topic. We also facilitate a grant opportunity, which is exciting for districts who are looking to increase the amount of financial education they are offering. So we have information about that on our website. Highly recommend you check that out if you are involved in any district grant opportunities. And our approach to financial education is very holistic. We really do not see financial education or personal finance as a standalone subject. It's wonderful when it can be taught in a full semester class. But we also recognize that, just like I mentioned before, money is touching so many different parts of our day-to-day lives. And similar to social emotional learning, it's possible to sprinkle financial education in throughout different curricular subjects throughout the day within social emotional learning, within CTE, with aspects of digital citizenship. So we really, again, don't see financial education as one size fits all. And that is part of the approach that you'll be seeing here today. The stars represent some of the areas we're going to kind of talk about when we comes to state taxes. So post-secondary planning, not always related specifically to what school or what training program am I going to attend, what am I going to do, but more related to where do I want to live and how will that component factor into my finances in a post-secondary world. Financial decision making, absolutely related to day-to-day spending. And then, of course, math. Anytime we're talking about taxes at percentages, we are going to key into what is a seventh grade math standard, but of course is ratios and percentages can be a great remedial skill to continue to focus on for any grade level. This is the math that is real. Will I use this in the real world? Yes, you will. Let me tell you how. So these are just some of the areas we'll talk about today. And last, I just want to go over our agenda. Bobby's going to start us off by talking about our unique tax system here in Washington. We're going to talk about our elements that are unique. I'm not going to give it away. The next part will be my section talking about bringing this into the classroom. Why are we talking about state taxes? Most tax information is going to focus on federal income taxes, right? But state taxes is not to be forgotten. And here are some strategies for bringing this information really in discussion form into the classroom. We have some writing applications as well. I will be honest with you, there are no curriculums that include state income tax lessons because it varies state to state. So we're looking at, again, different opportunities, hopefully a fresh take on financial education for you today. All right, so before we jump in to Bobby's presentation, I have a question for you. I have sales tax trivia. In case you didn't know, there is sales tax trivia. We can find anything on the internet, Linda. I know, she's smiling at me. So in blank, one of the following 4 states, if you take a hot air balloon ride, but the balloon is tethered to the ground, the ride is subject to an amusement tax. If the balloon is not tethered to the ground, the ride is considered transportation and is not taxable. A is Arkansas, B is Arizona, C is Kansas, and D is Maine. If you wouldn't mind, please voting in the chat with a letter. Let me know if you are safely able to, at your keyboard, give me an estimate. Now, I might have used some psychology there. You guys knew I was from Arizona. I said I was going to mention it. So many people are picking B, and I love it. The answer, in fact, is Kansas. In Kansas, it is taxable if it is tethered to the ground and not taxed, and transportation if it is untethered. So just some fun facts, another fun fact there. And I got one more here for you. All right. Here's another sales tax trivia. In what state bagels purchased whole or sliced and taken away are not taxed? However, a bagel that is toasted or served with a smear like cream cheese, that becomes a prepared food and is therefore subject to tax. Let's see, A is Washington, B is Maryland, C, New York, or D, Maine. I have one emphatic Washington. And then, oh, it looks like I have a split between mostly A's and C's in the chat. All A's and C's. 1B coming in from M. Herman. This is a New York tax law. Apparently it was a little controversial They were passing the prepared food taxes, but when it started to affect bagels, that's when people start to get upset. So the correct answer is C, New York. So thank you for playing along in the chat with me. And with that, Bobby, I am going to turn it over to you to tell us about Washington state taxation.
All right, like I said, everybody, hope that you're doing well. I got to see a look at mostly what folks' background is. So, like I said, it's nice to talk to you guys as a colleague. If you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. Amy's going to move the slides ahead, and I'm going to talk to you guys. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email at any time. And if you guys are already doing some tax stuff in your classrooms, that's a great thing to discuss. We're all here for a variety of different reasons. But your feedback's really important when we do those reflections at the end. So if you want to go ahead and move ahead, we will get started. All right, so we're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff. And if you already thought that Washington was a little different, it absolutely is. And when we get into that, that's important for a couple things. And I'm going to, wear this part on my sleeve. Like when we go over this, people feel different ways about the taxation structure. I'm an educator. And part of our job absolutely is to advocate for what's best. But I will say this, in the work that I've done in teaching financial education for quite a long time, there's no simple answers. And you might know more than me, and that's fine. But I can tell you that economists disagree on which structure is necessarily best. We happen to have a unique structure that looks a lot like kind of like Middle Eastern countries in a way. But our structure is very different than other places. And some of the stuff that I look at is, how are we different? The nuts and bolts of it. I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Okay, so like getting into those basic things is a little might be a little not as appropriate for the grade level, but talking about an income tax versus sales tax, those are absolutely things that you can talk about with your students, how that impacts them, how minimum wage impacts them, why if you live right across the border near Spokane, you might work in Washington State, the impact that if you live in Spokane, if you got a job in Coeur d'Alene, what might that mean? So those are the kind of things that we talk about with our students. So couple things. Washington does have a unique tax structure. There's no personal or corporate income tax, but we rely on other taxes that absolutely hit you, including sales tax and B&O taxes as well. And we'll talk about what that means. Before we move on, a couple things to know about is the B&O tax. We hear that a lot. If you don't own a business, you're like, what's a B&O tax? Also, too, throwing this out there as a teacher, if you teach DECA, if you teach anything else that deals with current technical education, man, start a business sometime. You can do it literally in like an hour if you didn't know that, okay? You have to set up a few things with the IRS, but it helps you understand some of these structures that exist, and that if you teach an entrepreneurship class or something along those lines, that would really help you understand the structures that work here in our state. So the B&O tax, let me pull my notes back up. The B&O tax is a gross receipts tax, okay? And that applies to total revenue of businesses, not profit, okay? Revenue. And so, two different things. You take in $10, but you spent $9. So what is your profit? Well, your revenue would be, the $10, but your profit's that $1. So it counts on all the revenue that exists. That's important. That's an important point to remember. We're going to be talking about retail sales tax, the capital gains tax, which is some very important information that we're going to talk about. And also, too, we don't have all the receipts for 2024. I'm going to talk about 2023 and 2024 and how that impacts the economy, what a use tax is, and that applies to goods purchased without a sales tax. Usually that's something that you bring in from another state, but that also requires us to be honest and talk about that. So there's some other pieces there where a lot of it's based on what are the choices that you're going to make. A retail sales tax is a percentage based on the sales of goods and services to consumers. And we have our number for the state, but we're also going to be also understand that can vary depending on your municipality where you live. There's a reason why sometimes when I live in Steilacoom, Washington, beautiful Steilacoom, Washington, I love it here, but I usually go shopping at the Costco in Lacey rather than the Costco in Tacoma. It just saves me a little tiny bit. It's like 0.2%, I think, in terms of the local sales tax. But it's just something to think about. That's not why I go down there. I go down there because the Costco in Tacoma is really busy and the one in Lacey's nowhere close. But that's another little thing to think about when you're making those purchases, okay? And if you live in the area, you absolutely know what I'm talking about. If you want to go ahead and move on to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm not going to talk about too much. So in the context here, and I think about this, I've been doing this presentation now, I think for 2 or 3 years, is thinking about what our expenditures are. I think that's one that's for another session here. But when we talk about what are the revenues that we collect, and this is the latest data that we have from the Office of Financial Management. And if you're looking for information too, if you want to put something together and you're like, hey, I went to this session, I'm listening to different things about taxation. There's so much information online. You can look up the OFM's data, and also the Department of Revenue has copious amounts of information. Things I say this as a teacher, and I'm a taxpayer, and the work I do here for FEPPP, but there is so much good information online, really good definitions. So you're going to see some interesting stuff here. What we're looking at here is our state revenue sources from fiscal year 2022. There's other data points that are out there, but I'm using these ones from OFM because we've been using kind of these sources to look at where do we get our money, how does that differ in Washington State versus the United States, and OFM puts this data together, which is really helpful for understanding that. And what you're looking at over here is all the different pieces, and what you're going to notice is that a huge part of the income in Washington State clearly is sales and receipt taxes. Like that's how we operate here. Okay, we don't have an income tax, and there's Amy's going to talk a little bit more about the pluses and minuses of not having income tax, how it affects different people based on their incomes. Some of the things that we can't, well, we'll get into that a little bit later, is it's really hard also to judge then what are the different public benefits that it received. So there's so many different data points here is what I'm trying to say, is that any kind of argument that you want to make, positive or negative, in my humble opinion, you can kind of make.
I think this is a wonderful representation of a percentage because of a percentage. I'm a math teacher. What am I talking about? Of numbers in a visual way. When you look at the percentage of individual and corporate income tax, what we could, like if you take that 20% that's represented in the yellow and you shift that over into Washington, the impact on the individual, to me, it's really interesting to start to think about where our dollars would start to go. Are we paying, you know what I mean? Like Bobby is saying, there's no quick answers to this. And we will dive a little bit more into how you could compare some of those, how much the income tax does affect you a little bit later.
The thing that I want to note here though is that anytime you hear about like as an educator, right? Like the big thing that I look for is how do we explain this to our kids? The biggest thing that's different and unique about Washington State is that B&O tax. And that's a big part of right here in our sales and gross receipts taxes. Okay. So no, we don't have an income tax. There are arguments in different directions about how that works. There's a lot of, if you look at the way that structures, if you've ever lived in Europe or if you live in other places, how do those things work? And also, too, what are the things that we receive in return? I am a proud school teacher. I'm a proud member of my union. I'm a proud, like, I love I attended school here in Washington State. My family graduated from public schools. I'm at Wazoo. So there's a lot of things that those taxes support, and we look at it different ways. And like I said, so if you ever have questions about that, that's fine. But I just wanted to make sure that you guys understand what we're really looking at is how is our state different and what does that mean over the longer term. And that being said, we can go ahead and go on to the next slide. Now, this kind of breaks down the revenue a little bit more, and this is from the Department of Revenue, their annual report. So this comes out a little bit early. This comes out before OFM takes that data, kind of crunches it in different ways. Like I said to you right now, if you look at this revenue at a glance part, right, some of the other state taxes that we've collected, and these are all in billions, also have to do with that capital gains tax, which we're going to talk about as well. The big thing to look at here when you see the tax revenue collect and what it provides. Oh, that's right. I'm not showing my screen, but the 15.9 billion right here is the retail sales and use tax. And then also the B&O tax is, $7 billion of our annual collections. Another big thing here in Washington that's huge is our property taxes. You guys know many of us are educators here. Many of us work for public schools. Well, those property taxes really matter, right? The levies, our bonds, everything else. So that's a huge part of the collections. And as you see down here, I don't have it broken out, but this is DOR says what are the biggest things that we pay for? Obviously, it's public schools. That by and large, That's our biggest thing that we spend money on. Healthcare, human services, public safety, and then natural resources. Those are the biggest things that the biggest expenditures that we have. Some of the other things that you have here too, you'll notice that we have the state retail sales and use tax, but what we also have is the local retail sales and use tax. And if you've done your taxes lately, and I don't know, call me crazy, but if you're sitting here today and you're on spring break, and if you're not on spring break anyways, you just got home from teaching, you probably helped somebody with their taxes and you went and looked online and you saw those tax rates and you saw that Washington has its number. And then depending on where you live, you have to add in that number. And that depends. If you're lucky enough to pass your standard deduction, which I haven't been for quite some time, for better or for worse, then you're able to use that and make some changes to the deductions that you have on your taxes. But this gives you a good idea, and all of these things are linked. Amy, do we send them the PowerPoint slides? So all of these guys have links to the documents that you can use. You can use these slides if you want. You know, these are provided by the state. But if there's anything in here and you're trying to explain to kids, well, you know, what does revenue look like? What does taxation look like? That's one of those things that you can look at right there. And with that being said, we can go ahead and move on to that next slide. So B&O taxes. It again is a tax on the gross revenue of businesses, not profit. That is extremely unique. And this is written into law. I didn't put the RCW in here. I thought about putting it in. I was like, yeah, nah. It has a physical, so the business has a physical presence nexus in Washington and has more than $100,000 in combined gross receipts sourced or attributed to Washington, or is organized and commercially domiciled in Washington. What does that mean? So there's a couple different things. You can organize your business in a lot of different ways. Does it have a physical presence in Nexus in Washington? Okay, so I was, oh gosh, let's see. What's a place that I went to recently that's new up here? Oh, okay, so well, Krispy Kreme's been around forever. What's the name of that? There's that chicken place that makes those chicken strips was opening in Vancouver. I can't remember what it was, but
Raising Cane's.
there you go, Raising Cane's. Okay, so Raising Cane's is not from Washington State, right? It's a business organized somewhere else, probably in Delaware, maybe in Texas, where it comes from originally. But now that it has a physical presence in Washington, it's absolutely has to pay that B&O tax. Okay, if you have a business that's under $100,000, you don't have to worry about that too much. But you know, a business that is not commercially domiciled in Washington has that much in gross receipts, then things might be a little different. There you go, Raising Cane's. Yep. Oh, I can't make a comment onto that, but it looks like you are a Chick-fil-A fan, and that is just fine, Amy. So the B&O tax is the business tax, and businesses include local governments as well as nonprofits, and that's really important to understand that your local governments. My dad is retired from the Navy after that his career, and then he went to work for the city of Tacoma. And one of the things that he worked in his job was understanding the tax payments that the state of Tacoma make. So if you didn't know that was a thing, it absolutely is. And that's the value of products, gross proceeds of sale, or gross income of business. And we will look at some more fun stuff about that. And gosh, isn't this fun, guys, going into all this detail. So here's the thing. Now, what are the taxes from B&O taxes and where do they come in from? Well, it's kind of all over the place. And this is one of those parts where, you know, under our current tax structure, it's not like a flat tax. There's nothing that's really like simple to this. And if you work in business, you understand one of those things that you have to do is figure out, well, what is this taxation like? What does it represent, or how do I claim this in my taxes? And there's a wonderful business with accountants and attorneys that focus specifically on Washington state taxation. They might also lobby in Olympia on what some of these tax rates are, quite honestly. But here's some of the things that you can look at as to what the tax classifications are. And again, this is all from this page is from, again, I think this is from DOR as well. And you can click on the links that are going to be in there. They'll take you directly to those links. This includes some other little pieces that are there, but this shows you all the different areas and what those tax rates are. And there's a lot of different pieces in there, including gaming that's included, the sale of timber, extracting timber, a whole bunch of other stuff in here, but there are many, many different other areas. I think we have a slide, and I can't remember if Amy left it in there, the one with all of the different tax. Yeah, we do. There's all sorts of little taxes that we have here that are related to collecting revenue. The other thing is that there is a surcharge to certain activities. And this is what happens because our tax structure was made, and we're going to talk about the law and some other pieces a long, long time ago. A long, long time ago by by folks before the state had changed as much as it had, because when we talk about why we don't have an income tax, well, it's kind of hard baked into our state constitution. It's also been settled law in front of the legislature, but there's a select advanced computing surcharge. Okay, so certain things that work in certain areas have certain charges. There's also things for specified financial institutions as well. But you can click on these links and you can see those special places, because sometimes a business is going to come up and they do business in Washington state and it might not fit neatly into a single category. So the question is going to be, well, how do we claim revenue for the state for a business that's operating in the state and working with the citizens that we protect and represent, and how do we collect those dollars? And that's one of the ways that the B&O tax might work, and currently, and that's why some new things will get added on there.
So, Bobby, before we move on from B&O tax, because this was not something I was super familiar with
Yeah.
before our last presentation together. So, when you're kind of looking at it, it's a massive number, like, right? Like $7 billion in total. So, from my understanding of what you're saying, like this is the cost of owning or operating a business in Washington is higher than other states because we have this tax. Like that is a true statement, right?
Man, okay.
No. Keep it simple. Keep it
No,
simple
I'm
with
gonna keep
me.
it simple. I can't. So I feel comfortable saying this. Like as a teacher, I can't tell you that the cost of owning a business in Washington State necessarily is going to be more expensive than another state. And the reason why I say that is because when we answer those, man, I'm gonna sound like a politician when I say this, but I'm just representing the state. Like it depends. Everything depends. Okay. Like you could say that it's cheaper to run a business here than it is if I cross state lines I did in Idaho. Okay. Absolutely. But then there's a whole bunch of other pieces that are involved. And then this is another thing that we have to say, and you can feel different about this, but you guys, I was born in the Philippines. I moved here when I was a little kid. There's a reason why we settled where, I'm a teacher. My wife's teacher. We were lucky enough to buy a house in beautiful Steilacoom, Washington. Those are some of the trade-offs that you get. Okay, you can say there's other pieces there, but how do I quantify the value of being able to walk 10 minutes and see the water? I'm just saying those are some
Okay.
things that I think about
Okay.
broadly, Amy, and so um, you know potentially sure, right? But then the
Well, I
number.
guess my follow-up then would be that there must be a lot of benefits because we obviously do still have a lot of businesses here
Well,
as well,
I mean,
right?
it's
Like,
beyond the scope of what we're talking about right now, but Washington State has a $16.66 minimum wage. Okay.
yeah.
And so this is some of that other stuff, guys, that goes beyond this. And yes, our cost of living is high, but if you actually look at the empirical data behind what the cost of, what income plus transportation, like housing plus transportation costs versus some other metropolitan areas outside the Puget Sound, outside of Spokane, you'll actually see that although things can be difficult because of the way that we're structured, there are some things that are more beneficial to businesses because of the disposable income of people, right? And like just,
Right.
when we go to these conferences and represent the state, and I'm talking to teachers from, Mississippi, Montana, or other places. I'm a maxed out teacher. My wife's a maxed out teacher, and I understand it's different around the state, but there are some different investments that we make. So that's why, and I always have to say, there's no easy answer. Like, right? Like we can argue for different things. Amy, it's absolutely fine. You're supposed to ask me
Yeah.
questions, but I'm just saying, like, is it simple to say, well, it's more expensive here? Like, if you live in Florida and you're like, where am I going to go start a business? You're probably not going to move to Washington. Okay. I think that's fair to say. But if you live in Puyallup and you're like, am I going to keep my business right here, right now? And my business has $1 million or underneath in revenue, then it would be just fine. So, all right. And we can go ahead and move on. Let's talk about sales tax. Now, sales tax, y'all know, and this is one that's great with my kids. And this is one of the easiest things because we haven't said this here, but when we talk about the standards, when you take the state standards, which are going under changes, and you want to drill down, what are the three things that kids need to know? Okay, and when you get down to the core of financial education, okay, there's uh, three big pieces that define what we try to teach in financial education. The National Jump Start Standards move on from this, and these come from the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, which is a really high-level international organization that looks at economics, personal finance. And the three things that we're trying to teach kids is um, interest rates, okay, percentages up and down, inflation, and you are correct, Ian, inflation, and also risk mitigation. Those are the three core things, okay? They all have to do with numeracy and understanding math, okay? Portions, ratio, fractions. I just want to throw that out there as a teacher. Like I said, I've taught elementary, I've taught high school, I'm now a middle school CTE teacher. This is one thing that is absolutely usable in your classroom. Students understand. I work in a high ML district. I work in a student with lots of newcomers, and I promise you, as I teach kids how to, build 3D CO2 race cars, they absolutely can understand the state tax rate. So as a teacher, I just wanted to share that with you guys. It is Washington's principal tax source. And hold on, what slide number are we on? It's collected on goods and services sold in Washington, currently 6.5% statewide, plus our additional local taxes. You'll notice here Spokane's is 3.4%. So 9.9% is their overall tax rate. It is Washington's largest revenue source and significantly impacts daily consumer spending. You can make some choices about this as well, and that's why different people in different parts of the state might advertise, "Come buy your car here." Here, like I said, I live here in Steilacoom, a little south of Tacoma, in the Seattle Tacoma area, and lots of dealerships in the Peninsula area, Gig Harbor out there. They advertise that the tax rate's lower when you want to buy a car. So that's a little piece that impacts that. For some people, you want to get your car serviced at Tacoma Subaru. Hey, I'm a teacher, I drive a Subaru. Shocking, right? So you want to get, like, which place do you go to? How does that impact your tax rate? Those are some of the things that you can look at. And then there's a little bit in here too. We talk about taxation for tribes. My wife is Nez Perce, so the impact of tribal sovereignty is something that's a big part of my family and my life. And if you also heard what I'm doing for my dissertation, but that's important to understand that our tribes do have sovereignty. So we're looking at something different there when we're looking at our local tribes. And you guys know this right here. And if you live in Seattle, now Seattle might be a little bit higher. I know Tacoma, I don't know off the top of my head if it's 10.35, but Seattle absolutely has the highest tax rate. I mean, that's just kind of how it's always been, right? That's a choice that you make locally. And one of the things we can talk to our kids about civic education is you got to vote. You want to make a change to what's going on here, you got to vote. Go to meetings. Talk to your legislators, talk to your city council. You have an impact on that. I can tell you here in Steilacoom, we have a pretty low. When we get property taxes, we have a pretty low property tax rate in comparison to other places, and that's has positives and that has negatives, but those are things that we have an impact on, and making our students understand that this doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like when you are going to go on, you're going to, be a contributor, you're going to pay taxes. So all of these things have reasons. And then you could also have that conversation. Why is there a higher tax rate in Seattle than there is, let's say, in Ritzville? Okay, why do those taxes change? Is it because, well, we believe differently? Well, it could be part of it too, but also what are the services that are needed? If you live in Seattle and you make certain choices about and you can agree or disagree, okay? Like I always say, whenever we talk about these things, I like to think in terms of being agnostic into the expenditures, right? Like as a teacher when I'm teaching my kids, but talking specifically about the collections and not the expenditures. And if you really want to know, if you look up, you can just Google Washington local tax rates, like I said, and you will find the list of all of the latest tax rates for everywhere in Washington state. And the lowest tax rates generally are going to be in unincorporated parts of the state. So generally, hey, there you go. Somebody posted it. It's really easy to find there. And I know I have a couple more sets of taxes to do here with my family, and I will be looking at that. Now let's get
Just for the
into
record,
oh, sorry,
for
go ahead.
just
Go
for
ahead.
the record, those in the chat who have listed out their local tax rate, lowest so far of participants we have here looks like Prosser, Washington. So.
And here we go. Let's go into some other stuff that supports public education in Washington state. So the cannabis tax. And I realize we should probably talk a little bit more about the liquor tax, but here's some data that tells us about, in millions of dollars, what our collections were for the cannabis taxes. And it incurs both a retail sales tax and an excise tax from the liquor and the cannabis board. So the cannabis taxes help fund healthcare, education, enforcement, and general state funds. So there's some other business activities that occur in the terms of that. So you can see right here the B&O tax. So this impacts the cost of the use tax, or we could call it they use different terms. Oftentimes you'll hear in New York, especially in the state of New York, they talk about in terms of a sin tax that might be applied to something like that. But there's a lot of different pieces that are here. And that is a lovely question, and we will answer that for you when we move a little bit further on. Because I don't know off the top of my head how much we get from lottery, but that is a great question. So this tells you a little bit about the money that's used for this, and it also tells you, well, where does this money go to? What is it? What do we support with these dollars? And you can see if we go in here, the different pieces, how much goes to education, recreational cannabis products. That is correct. Healthcare, research and testing, licensing enforcement, education prevention, local government, and the state general fund. Now, again, you can make different choices about, we're all going to come from different backgrounds and think different things, but what are the realities of where these dollars go to? And the reality is that nearly $500 million in the last tax cycle. Well, what are the positives and what are the negatives for anything that we spend on? I often think about in terms of we make that reference to Washington being more similar to, gosh, some smaller European countries, or in terms of our tax structure to countries in the Middle East, we definitely have. I don't think it was on purpose. I don't think the timber barons and the folks doing fishing and shipping in the early 20th century and late 18th century were thinking we're trying to be a lot like Denmark or anything like that. But in the end, our tax structure ended up looking a little more different in its application. So. And it's funny now, gosh, I can't believe it's been around for this long. My son turns 22 this year. I'm just trying to think about some of those different pieces, but it's kind of an established part of our structure that we have. And it looks like, Amy, we have a hand up. We have a question right now. Is that correct? Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but so the government or the federal government doesn't recognize cannabis, like they can't use banks and all that kind of stuff,
Right.
I guess. Like, so how do they get the revenue from the sales tax without it being kind of a legitimate, I guess you could say, type of business?
Well, so we not going into that too much, Ian, but like the the state has the right to levy taxes in the way that it wants. There's a separation between what they control and what the state can control. And what you're saying is absolutely correct, and that has to do with the way that that banking systems work between different states. However, some credit unions, especially credit unions, are providing banking services for companies that sponsor that are in the cannabis industry. So that exists there. I think, when we look at the bigger picture, the question would be is how would and again, it goes beyond the scope of what we're talking about right now, but how would the state uh, or how would the federal government attempt to uh, to carry out enforcement activity when you have X number of states that are already using it, and they make certain choices as to how that's implemented. I remember I went to school back on the East Coast, and golly, so in 2000, I think I moved out there, and I remember I was blown away. I went into a Burger King. I still remember my first time being in Ohio, and people were smoking cigarettes and in the Burger King. And I had a job, and they were smoking at there. And I remember being like, wow, because we had outlawed that in public places quite a bit of time before that. I graduated high school in 1996. And so there's lots of different things that the states do individually have control over. So that's just one thing that I would say. But if you want to take a look, because I remember I just did some stuff and I was clicking through and I got a question specifically about that. You can take a look at, thank you, Amy, for those wonderful notes. You can take a look at a local credit union, and they'll have information about if you are a provider of cannabis services, how you are going to do your banking. And now let's get into capital gains. Go ahead.
Really
sorry.
quick.
Yeah.
You're good. I am going to go ahead and just answer one of the other questions that was
Please
in
do.
the chat before we move on. So lottery revenues for fiscal year 2023 totaled, and again, that's how they wrote it, but we're looking at like over $1 billion of revenue is how I'm reading this. With the majority of the money going to the Washington Opportunity Pathways account, the general fund, the economic development account, and the problem gambling account. Just for those people who are, or for anyone who is curious about the impact of gambling. And here's your next slide, Bobby.
Right. And see, there's so much we could talk about in terms of gambling and other things. Like, why? Anyways, it's all interesting stuff. It's choices that we have to make as a state. But now we're going to talk about capital gains, and this is where things get a little sticky because we don't have an income tax, but kind of any other place. And I don't mean to make a judgment here. The Supreme Court made a judgment on this, particularly in Quinn v. Washington State in 2023. Well, getting ahead of myself. Sorry, I'm talking to you guys about is this an income tax or not? What I am saying is that capital gains tax is a 7% tax on investment profits exceeding $250,000 annually. So it doesn't affect a whole ton of people. In the first year in 2023, we collected 889. Just look at my time. Good. Okay. $889 million, and that goes to education and early learning. This year, so far, we have collected only so far. So as of now, $433 million. Now, there's lots of reasons why. Okay. So one of the pieces there is that you don't have to pay immediately. Some of the interesting parts though are that the top collections in terms of capital gains tax, and they don't say who the individual is, but the top collections have stayed mostly the same. If you have gotten this and you have had capital gains, and so that is assets like the sale of stock, for example. Okay, it's not the sale of your home. It generally there's deductions if you sold your family-owned business. It's mostly for people with very high incomes that have collected quite a bit in the sale of stocks, bonds, or other sorts of financial instruments. And those sales have to exceed $250,000 for the year. Now, so far this year, we've collected $433 million as a state. However, people can extend their payments. There's lots of different things you can do, especially when there's that much money that's involved. And if you're making a large payment, such as $142 million, which was the highest payment in 2024. Yes, that is correct. That's how much money whoever that made in capital gains had to pay in terms of their taxes. There's some other tax things that you can do to move ahead with that. So that still exists. The Supreme Court said it's going to happen. Whether that's an income tax or not, that's all in the eye of the beholder, but it affects a very small percentage of the population, and that continues to support public education. If we can go ahead and move on to the next one. All right, use tax. So again, this is something that you bought out of state, and the big one that I use to that you got to pay taxes on. Okay, so here's the example of this one. I have some signed baseballs. Okay, I like baseball, and I have a baseball signed by Ben Bernanke. He was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank during the mortgage crisis, and he loves baseball. And so I have a ball signed by him. When I bought it out of state, or if I bought that out of state, I actually bought it on eBay. But if I bought it out of state or I bought a big piece of art, I might have to pay a use tax here in Washington. And it's also on states that don't have a sales tax. So somebody who is not also, if you buy something for someone who is not authorized to collect sales tax. So if you're making purchases of somebody, they're not collecting sales tax. You, out of the goodness of your heart, and I'm sure that you would do that, but you would let the federal government, you would let the state government know that you need to pay for that. That's one way that a use tax could work. That's the kind of important thing to know about that. It helped maintain fairness in taxation by compensating for unpaid sales tax on out-of-state purchases. That's a real thing, and we really, really, really depend on the folks declaring that they made these purchases. Okay, and going ahead because we are running short on time. The next thing that we're going to take a look here is property tax. And you guys know, if you're homeowners like I am, that is something that you pay. And it's managed at the county level, not the state level. That's really important. And if you ever go visit OSPI, and depending on which way you go, if you're going to pass that county's building that's right there. So the county taxation organizations are really important, and it significantly funds our local services and particularly schools, as you guys know about that. So if you fail a levy or whatever else, it can impact you. It can impact how many people are employed there, and that is where your assessor does those valuations. DOR, Department of Revenue, will give you links to look at your local taxation, where your local taxes are as well. And we're going to go ahead and get into our last couple slides. We're going to go quick. So there's a whole bunch of other taxes, okay? Little taxes that get added on. Like you go to a we had a birthday party at the Rainiers game the other night. There's some local taxes. There's taxes on your hotel room. There's taxes when you go to watch the Kraken. There's taxes when you buy cigarettes. There's taxes on your phone bill to help support a whole bunch of stuff like enhanced 911. There's all sorts of taxes that are out there. These are just some of them. Okay, let's go on to the next one there, Amy. And if you have any questions about those things, so there's good stuff that those are for too. But we have lots of different taxes. There's taxes there's states that have more taxes than us, just so you know. And other taxes. So
I'm
final.
just I threw the actual website in there because
Oh,
it
that's great.
might
Yeah.
look like
Yeah.
we made this slide, like, oh, I just made a list and I made this slide. This is literally what the website
I
looks
think it
like.
might be a
Every
screenshot.
single one of these taxes has a link you can follow to give more details about them.
Oh
So
no,
I
I
put
didn't.
that link in there right away for you guys.
Okay. So each state's, oh, this is a little different. It looks like our slides. That's okay. Oh, look at that. See, I didn't know that. Look at that fancy stuff that you're doing. And I'm a Microsoft certified trainer. I should know better than that, right? Okay, so yes, we have a really high tax rate. Your friends that complain about our tax rates, they are correct. Okay, but again, on balance, you have to think about that. I have a friend who just moved to Georgia, and he was a state employee, and he was shocked to find that due to his income and a few other things, his marginal tax rate's actually higher out there. They have lower gas tax rate, but that, what do we do? What does that pay for? You can make your choices about that. But we do absolutely have one of the highest taxes in the nation on taxes. That's empirically correct. So that science is at 52.8%. We don't include local taxes. If you live in Seattle, you guys know you have higher taxes. There's the Jumpstart payroll tax that exists up there. And we also do things like the working family tax credit that you need to know about. We don't talk a lot about these things, but here in Washington, 163,000 families received up to a $1,200 refund in the taxes that they pay. And we don't pay income taxes, right? So that's just kind of a refund that the legislature made for low-income families and workers to help to offset that, and they get $1,200 back. So there are some things that we do here to mitigate that. It's because we have this kind of wonky structure. It's not where you're going to not pay taxes, but those are things that existed. And there's lots of data here. The one thing I want to show you here too is this shows you where Washington is in terms of our taxes and GDP. So there's lots of different ways that you can look at this. And this is from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Going on to the last one, and this is our fun slide. And Amy, man, we're doing pretty good. I'm looking at our timer there, 4:44. Hey, we're going to be on time. Okay, so why don't we have an income tax, man? So in 1932, voters approved an income tax to reduce property taxes, but it was struck down by the state Supreme Court. Since then, Washington's tax structure has looked at things in a different way. Now, you can make, again, like lots of different choices about the composition of the Supreme Court, and this was a huge one in 32. But the judges found that it was not, you couldn't, that it did not follow the state constitution, and they could have different reasons for it, okay, politically or whatever else, but over time this has become well established. The last challenge to the income tax, I believe, was in the early 80s. There was another push to have an income tax, so I was just a little kid back then. And then and we just don't have an income tax per se. Again, an argument can be made that, and an argument was made in front of the state Supreme Court that the capital gains tax is included as an income tax, okay? And if you pay capital gains tax at the federal level, well, heck yeah, that's seen as an income tax. But in terms of the way that's interpreted here in state law, that is not an income tax. So that, just that's why we don't have an income tax. We have this different structure, and there's a lot of arguments amongst economists about, is it better to have a sales or a use tax? Okay, if you've ever been to Europe, you pay a VAT tax. They do things in a different way. They also pay way more in tax than we do, but that's a whole other story for another time. But there's choices that we can make in terms of taxation. And in general, will an income tax come here? I don't think so. Kind of ever. I mean, maybe, I don't know, maybe in the way future, but also at the same time, lots of people like to pay money to advocate for an income tax, but it's kind of settled state law. It's kind of settled case law here, and there's different ways that we can handle that. And it's kind of interesting, right? This is part of how things go. And overall, like I love my hometown. I love my state. There are things that I like to change, but when I teach my kids, this is the stuff that we need to know. And I think that is all that we got, and we're in time. And Amy, my name does not have an E in the back, but that is okay.
Oh my goodness.
It's not the end of the world. Amy and I have worked together for years. It is quite all right. And if you guys have any questions, Robert is my formal name, but Bobby is my nickname that I use at things. You can find me anywhere, guys. Like if you have any questions about how you're going to do this, Amy's going to go into some more stuff about implementation. I'm going to be here. If you have any questions, I'm going to wait till the end, Amy. I have class at 5:45, guys, and I'm going to do a little bit of work. My camera's going to be off. But if you have anything in particular, please let me know. And feel free to send me a direct message here in Zoom or anything else. And Amy, thank you again. It's great partnering with you.
Thank you, Bobby. I always appreciate anybody who can bring passion and excitement to the topic of taxes. And that is why I consistently invite Bobby to come and speak on this subject. Thank you so much. If you have any questions, please let us know what, continuing as we move through this that either I or Bobby can answer for you. We will please put those into the chat. I just want to do a quick check, see how everyone's doing. It's a lot of content, it's a lot of material, right? And so there are some ways that our state is really unique. Before we dive in to anything, I want to see if I'm going to throw one more piece of trivia here into the chat. Okay, so again, I love to use trivia anytime I can within classroom setting. Like to take that, and I'm correcting it here, in some state, a leading domestic seafood supplier, an enhanced food fish excise tax includes species of food fish, so fish that other fish eat as food, shellfish, and, we're going to try and say this, anadromous game fish caught in territorial and adjacent waters. We have guesses already. I didn't even have to give multiple choice. I love that. Alaska are great, fantastic guesses because a leading domestic seafood supplier. We would think Alaska would be a very logical choice. Maine also a logical choice. Melissa thinks Washington. So between Alaska, Maine, or Washington, thank you so much to everyone participating in the chat. The answer here is Washington. This is ours. If we were to go back to our list and all my animations, I believe we will see a fish tax on here, food fish. Enhanced food fish tax. There it is in the first column. Yes, Melissa saw it on the list. Awesome. Forgive me for scrolling again forward through animations to get back. So Melissa, way to pay attention, right? We would think, oh, it's like food for pet fish. No, they actually are going to charge you an extra tax based if you catch fish that other fish eat as food. So let's talk about ways to make state tax accessible and easy to understand for our students. And so one of the things that we reference here is the taxfoundation.org. This is a fantastic resource. I put the link or the address in the chat as well. And that's where I found this visual that we see here on the left, which is sales taxes in your state as of January 2025. I love to use visuals, right? So we can see here just visually and using our key on top that we are in a pretty high area of the key. The darker the purple, the higher the tax rate. We are very purple. So it's just something we want our students to be aware of because our sales tax does impact our day-to-day spending, particularly kind of how Bobby touched on this, when we start looking at our neighbor states, and depending on where you are living in Washington, right? My closest neighbor state over here in Eastern Washington is Idaho, which we see as a nice corally pink, not as light as it could be. But then Montana and Oregon, within our little corner over here, are both no sales tax states. Okay, so their day-to-day spending is going to be impacted on a much different level than ours. This is the first consumer awareness I love for our students to have. They know it, but this is explicitly locking it in. That sale price, that sticker price is not the amount you pay at the cash register if you grew up in one of these colored states, right? That 99, for me, it's the 99-cent Arizona iced teas. I am old enough to remember when you could get 2 for 99 cents. Thank you very much. I see Amy nodding. She understands me. Okay, my students back in Arizona could get 1 for 99 cents. It was still the after-school drink of choice. But it says it on the can, but they knew they weren't paying 99 cents when they got up to the register. But to make the explicit connection, that is because of sales tax, right? That is why that sale price or that sticker price is not the real price that we are going to be asked to pay. So even for our youngest students or children in our lives, this is a great way to start building consumer awareness. We want to put an actual number to it. 9.43 is going to be our average state. And I think if we average the numbers we had in the chat, we would get pretty close to that. Fourth highest sales tax, combined average sales tax on the map. All right. So when tourists are coming to Washington, like for example, coming to Spokane for the March Madness tournament that was just here, is it to their advantage to be shopping while they're here? This is one of the ways we can start thinking about day-to-day spending. So question, what value does a 10% discount have when we think about it in the context of comparing it to our state sales tax? Right? So I'm over here at 9.9. I saw some people over 10. Okay, so in our heads as consumers, we see our price and then we get this discount, we're getting 10% off. We eliminate sales tax in our head when we are mentally calculating, when we are mentally shopping, right? We don't consider it. So this is a great way for all of us, consumers of all ages, to be more aware. So if we have our item and we're getting a 10% discount, right? But then still being taxed roughly 10%. Okay, you're right around that item price. You might be like 1/10 of 1% lower or whatever. I'm not saying that math right, but you know what I mean. You're not going to be that far off. So instead of thinking, oh, this is a 10% discount, that's what a deal, I should get that, right? Okay, that is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, yeah, 10% is going to be my minimum discount that I'm looking for because that at least kind of counteracts my sales tax, right? Also in some of the, yes, thank you, Kathleen. I am a former math teacher, so I do appreciate it whenever anyone says this would be a good math lesson. So other ways to build this into consumer awareness, and this has been such a good reminder for me. I just went through and did this on my monthly budget, especially now that we all know the cost of living is going up, right? The consumer price index shows us those grocery bills are going up and getting higher. One great way to be realistic and to avoid overspending is to account for sales tax in your budget or monthly money plan, right? So if, for example, you have $200 budgeted for groceries this week, this month, whatever, your budget is actually $180 plus that 10% sales tax. That will keep you under your budget of $200. So just a different way of looking at numbers. Often when we're doing lessons on budgeting, even standalone, like fun math lessons on budgeting, we don't think about tax. So just keeping that awareness, it's always going to be something we have to pay as Washingtonians. On online shopping forums, they're going to do that on purpose, right? It's of course it makes sense that they wouldn't tell you tax until the end when you give them your address, because how would they know? But it's another way of just getting you to forget that that is an additional amount that's going to be in your cart, right? So for us in this state, it's great 10% math practice. If you're keeping a mental, count or just looking at your cart and you have $78 worth of things in your cart, okay, adding another $7.80, you could round it to $8 for tax, no sticker shock, less buyer's remorse, and hopefully staying within our means a little bit more. And then we need to be aware of use tax laws for large purchases. I can admit that when I was a teenager, I thought I could probably be like so smart and go to Oregon and buy a car and no one in Washington would know, you know what I mean? And they're smarter than that, right? So we want to make sure we're aware of the laws. Like Bobby said, they are required, they're built on the requirement of reporting them, right? So it's also could definitely be an interesting, I guess, the ethics of it, is the difference between, driving to perhaps IKEA in Portland versus the IKEA in, oh, it's right by Tacoma, or I'm not exactly sure where it is over there on the
It's in Renton. I was there this weekend.
Renton, right? So, I mean, there's an ethical consideration there, definitely, right? We want to make sure you know the laws, but also just, awareness. Like, oh yeah, you could go to Oregon and buy the car, but just so you know, they're going to add that tax onto either the registration at the point of sale or when you register the car in Washington. So you're not going to get out of it. Again, different types of awareness. Bobby, did you turn your camera on because you had something to add?
Oh no, not necessarily.
Oh, okay. I saw you pop in, so I thought I would just check. Okay. So one other thing to just keep in mind when you're looking at, you'll see the words regressive and progressive tossed around a lot when we talk about taxes, right? And in general, according to research, this is not an opinion, retail sales tax is regressive, meaning that lower income households are affected more by it. The reason for this, according to the research base that I read, was that they're spending a higher percentage of each paycheck on goods and services, and therefore are more impacted on that day-to-day basis by sales tax. So that's just something to be aware of. Okay, I'm so proud of this slide, you guys. I can't even tell you. Linda, are you ready for this? Okay, so this is an example of another activity you could do to add in some math, or and this is where we kind of get into some of that post-secondary planning. So let's talk about my life experience. Born and raised in Spokane, Washington, did move myself to Portland, Oregon, and lived sales tax free for a while. Bonus was with that Oregon ID, I could come back to Washington and still get no sales tax. Then I moved back to Washington State before living in Spain. Actually experienced the European tax system a little bit too, and then settling in Arizona for a while. So when I lived in Glendale, the sales tax rate locally combined with the state was 9.2%. This is really high compared to Arizona in general. Arizona is a pretty tax-friendly state. They don't like them. They don't like to pass them. They don't like to raise them. So for us to have a 9.2 in Glendale is one of the highest in the city, but the reason is they're paying for the stadium. They're paying for the football stadium that the Arizona Cardinals play at, and they're going to be paying for it for a while. So we end up with a higher tax rate. It was almost always worth it for me to do my day-to-day shopping in a different Peoria or Phoenix proper. They do have a rental tax in Arizona, although I do believe that recent legislation in the last year, because of the housing crisis affecting the whole country, they're limiting the rental tax. But I did pay 2.5% on my monthly rent, which was $1,200 a month. They have a pretty low gas tax, at least compared to us, at 19 cents a gallon. And most recently, they're averaging just over $3.50 a gallon. So I felt living there, and I don't know if the numbers, you got to go back in time, right? I felt gas was significantly less expensive living there. Someone said it was because we were closer to Texas. I don't know if that's true, but it felt less expensive. And then also I paid state income tax as a public school educator. I didn't make much, but I did pay a 1.75% tax on it. So then, this is the part I'm excited for. I was very proud of that animation. I moved to Spokane, Washington. And a lot of people said when I was moving, oh, well, that's a great move. Your cost of living is going to be so much lower than here in Phoenix. I was teaching in Glendale, living in Phoenix proper. They're very close. So, but when I moved here, I didn't really feel that in my pocketbook at all. And when I look at the notes, or at the percentages, I can kind of understand now why. The sales tax here is 9.9%, and not for a reason I could put in parentheses besides just like life living. Like that's just, it's just a higher, we know now that's just the cost of living in Washington. Property taxes. So granted, my living situation changed. I did purchase property here. in Washington, but I do pay now 1/100% on the estimated value of my house, which I don't actually know. I'm going by what my neighbor sold their house for the other a couple weeks ago. And then we have a 53-cent per gallon gas tax here, averaging around $3.90, which I know those of you over on the west side will say, what, that average is low. But we have a wide range here, but then no state income tax, right? So if you are a senior student looking at a couple options for school, or just maybe not about to go to school, but just entering the workforce, right? And you're considering a move, you want to be considering these types of things, these tax rates, to see how your day-to-day life, your pocketbook is going to be affected on the day-to-day. If I was doing this with my students, I would say, this is her, this is my life in Arizona. Here is my opportunity in Spokane. We do some math to come up with some answers. And then I would ask them, what other information do you need to make a responsible financial decision? If you're me in this situation, or the person choosing between Glendale and Spokane in this situation, what other information would you want to have? So in this case, it could be, well, why, you bought instead of renting. What if you rented? What's your income going to be there? There could be a lot of different variables that you could dig into, but that's another way to kind of consider how much the state tax rate really does affect us. In addition, this stuff is in the news a lot. So this is a great opportunity to take a look at our regional coverage and use that source as sort of an evaluative tool. So I'm going to list a bunch of articles in the following couple slides, and just some of the thoughts I had over here on the right. But we really kind of cover a few topics. Where the proposed state gas tax increase, which, yeah, they want to increase it, right? The state budget deficit, and the proposed tax increases to make up that budget shortfall. So really, the articles really aren't about the deficit so much. That's just kind of the required knowledge to understand that a lot of these taxes are going to be the solution to make up some of the money. And Bobby, I'm going to say this, and I hope I'm correct. An excise tax is a tax on an experience. Is that a correct definition? I don't know if I have Bobby here. Oh, yeah. So I believe that's a lot of what we're looking at here would be considered excise taxes. So you can compare points of view. You could ask your students to use these sources to research or defend a position. And as always, when we can look at ripple effects on not just our pocketbook, how would this affect our community, city, and state? Those are great social studies connections, because we're looking at what things are being used. What is this revenue being used to pay for? You could absolutely use this also to look at, hey, there's political messaging in this article. So how do we separate and identify what is political messaging versus what is information about, the tax state of, or the state of our budget in Washington? There's a better choice of words.
So Amy, the like B&O taxes or excise taxes, because they affect like a specific industry, right? Okay, so you saw how it was broken down, right?
But yeah,
excise taxes generally focus on one particular thing. So
one particular thing.
Instead of like having a generalized sales tax, right, which is for like, you have your exceptions, whatever else, but that's like the simple, like an excise tax is focused on, like people that put on that's what you look at.
So a lot of these proposed tax increases are going to be excise taxes, the ones that we make up for the budget shortfall. So thank you so much, Bobby. I want to make sure I'm using that term correctly. The other, last note I would make is that looking at the difference between regional coverage is really, really interesting to me, especially since I moved back to the state. So looking at maybe a Seattle area article versus a Spokane area article, I don't want to make it like an East versus West kind of thing, but just looking at the different points of view, because you definitely will see that represented in some of what I've listed here for you guys. Okay, so in one slide, we're going to have the lawmakers approving the gas tax increase. So we have 2 articles from the Washington State Standard. And that I really like as a resource just because they do focus so much on legislative reporting. So it's very factual. And they don't have a lot of excess on their website either. Then I have this headline. Of course, you're going to go for the headline. It's ridiculous. Washington drivers frustrated gas taxes may be going up yet again. Then we have another kind of concern point of view, truckers concerned about proposed Washington gas tax increase. So again, looking at articles that will show us different points of view on one subject that is affecting our state.
Hey, Amy, can I give you a teachable moment for this? And I just want to say one of the key things here is remember that taxes work not just for revenue collection, but also to be nudges in terms of the way that we do things. So, for example, taxing soda might get people to stop using soda. There are also some kind of underlying pieces here. And I was in downtown Tacoma today and couldn't find parking because of some of the the way rail worked. And it's great that it exists, but it also is a nudge in some ways, especially if you live in the Pierce County region, to take advantage of the mass transit things that exist. So it's not always just about tax collection. A piece of that can also be a policy. So there's policy pieces underlying that as well that comes through.
That's a great, that's a great point of view to consider as well. What are we trying to influence with this tax?
And not every legislator might feel that way, but that's definitely part of the holistic, like the way the lobbying and everything else is involved.
Mm-hmm. And then there's this idea, and I put this separate down here because I didn't want this bullet to be attached to the other bullets, because one Washington legislature proposed an idea on charging taxes based on gas mileage. So it's only going to affect you how far you drive. Okay. And so many outlets picked up this story. Like it was like a fact. Like this was something that was going to start happening. And that's not really the reality of it. So I also kept this article in there. This guy had one suggestion for one idea, but how does the way that the article is framed, the headline is written, kind of give us a bias before we even get into the article. So again, just using a context, they're learning about taxes while they're evaluating sources. Sneaky personal finance. So then the next group of, if you have been watching the news the last couple of days, did anybody see this this joy tax story? It was on my local television news, and then it came across my feed as well. So a lot of this section is gonna have more of a little bit of a political bent bias to it, because this is where you could really dig into the political messaging side of it, I think, right? So we have a couple articles on just the differences between in our state legislature, the Democrats have the majority, right, in both the House and the Senate, but they have very different ideas on how we're going to fix the budget deficit that we're in. For example, if we went back to gas taxes, the House wants to raise, I want to say like 4 billion or 9 cents, and a couple other things, hoping to raise 4.4 billion. The Senate is only trying to raise it 4 cents. So there's a lot of difference in opinion here, but so they have differences on how are we going to raise the money. We're $15 billion in deficit. How are we going to raise the money? Oh, I actually have notes here. Look, I didn't have to go back to the other thing like I did. So the House wants to raise the gas tax 9 cents, add a 0.3% sales tax on vehicles based on their fuel economy, and impose no state worker furloughs. So kind of like what Bobby's talking about, lots of different aspects to this. The Senate would add 6 cents, not 9, but every electric vehicle would add $50 to that registration, a luxury tax on high-end vehicles, and furlough all state workers for 13 days within the transportation department in an effort to make up $3 billion. And both of these plans are over 6 years. So one of the stories that came out, like I said, was that these taxes are joy taxes because they're excise taxes on experiences, right? So for example, one of them is that I can't remember the name of it, but the park pass, the Discover Park Pass that gives you access to all of Washington State parks would like more than double in price as one of the taxes that they're talking about here as a way to make up some of this revenue. So that is, they're saying, a joy. So we're gonna watch a little bit of this, a
I'm
very
not rocking with a
short
lot of this AI stuff,
article.
but AI on Wix, now that's a vibe.
No, not Wix.
Back in our region, lawmakers in Washington are grappling with how to make up for a multi-billion-dollar deficit. Some of their latest proposals are being criticized as, quote, joy taxes. Catherine Cook is here now to explain. So, Catherine, what kinds of proposals are we talking about here?
Well, Christine, some ideas include adding a 10-cent refundable deposit for cans and bottles and taxing nicotine pouches like regular cigarettes. And how about adding $1 to Mariners and Seahawks tickets? Those are just a few examples of what Republicans are indeed calling joy taxes, and they don't like them. The Democrats behind the taxes and budget proposals say they're needed to avoid deep cuts and fund necessary services, like a 6-cent gas tax increase and higher ferry rates to help pay for road projects. And then there's the Discover Pass, which gets you into state parks. The price would go up from $30 to $45 a year.
Wow.
Hunting and fishing license rates would go up too. House Minority Leader Representative Drew Stokesbury calls the list troubling, while Democrats behind the budget proposals say they're necessary in order to keep services.
You might hear from Democrats that they want to tax wealthy Washingtonians and big businesses, and yes, they are taxing those folks, but they're also taxing regular people too. And I hope that regular people realize how many nickel and dime taxes they'll have to pay, literally taxing the joy out of their lives.
When I think about what taxes pay for, people find joy in having a well-funded public school. They find joy in having services at the local, county and city levels that work, having infrastructure.
All of the new proposals will be up for debate at the Capitol over the next month. Christine.
Appreciate you breaking it all down for us. Thank you.
So again, you have the article link there in case that's something you want to reference as well. And this is something that will be ongoing. So it is a great current event to keep your students up with, because even if they're not paying some of these like now, there's enough of them that they will impact I believe every Washingtonian.
Catherine.
Okay, and then briefly touching on this topic, because I know, as Bobby mentioned, there's so many facets to the cost and benefits of state income tax. And what I was looking for was a very simplified way to bring this to a student experience. And so I found this chart from SoFi, which I recognize is small, and I apologize if you're having difficulty seeing it on the screen. It really just identifies 3 pros and 3 cons. So the pros are spending less money on your income taxes. It's therefore it's easier to file and also cheaper. You're not paying for a tax company to file your software. Blah, blah, blah. You guys understand where I was going with that. And then it attracts people. So it helps your state grow. It attracts other workers to your state. Cons would be other taxes like sales and property tax are higher. Lower infrastructure and education spending. That should matter to all of us if we're in a classroom giving this content, right? And then a potentially higher cost of living. So again, this is one very simplified pros and cons list, but I wanted to give you something you could start with in case you wanted to bring this topic in with your students. Besides just looking at the pros and cons, I think creating some sort of display, a digital graphic, a poster, or a short form video on why we should or shouldn't have an income tax could be a good activity, as well as writing an opinion letter to your legislature. It's never too early to start encouraging civic engagement from our students. If you have a classroom economy, I would highly recommend that you add taxes. I mean, you are the state kind of, so you could be a state income tax, but that is another great way to add real world experience to our students. So the other thing about just thinking about when state taxes impact us. It's not just filing your taxes once a year, right? Yes, that is a time once a year when we're filing our taxes in April that matters. But state taxes, we're paying attention during elections, especially if we're voting on bonds or levies or increases. Again, when we're choosing a job, when we're buying a vehicle, where we're buying that vehicle, where we're purchasing a home or property, or opening a business. The death of a family or loved one is also an area where state taxes are really going to impact your life, which a lot of us in our adult times might reference. Maybe kids don't have so much of a context for that, but it's still true. Cashing out your retirement and then moving states. So let's look at earning income, because federal and state taxes are automatically deducted from paychecks. So when our kids are earning, they are having that money should be automatically deducted just like us. So let's actually, for our last activity here, take a look at what state taxes and state income tax, how would that actually impact, let's say, me, if I am choosing between these two jobs, right? So we have job A in Spokane, Washington, job B just across the border in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And we're just looking at a $50,000 salary. I was trying to do a number that was, somewhat realistic. We know that a lot of our kids won't be making 50 grand coming straight out of school, entering the workforce, but still. Okay, so first we wanted to look at a tool for figuring this out. So I used a free paycheck calculator. Okay, I used one resource out there and I trusted the resource. So it might be a little off, but here we go. For job A in Spokane, my state income tax is 0%, $0. So at a 50,000 a year with semi-monthly take home, right? I'm looking at just over $3,500 net monthly, and annually around $42,168. Not bad, right? Okay, so I'm using that same tool, and all I'm doing is changing this location, which you can see up here. All I'm going to do is change the location to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, okay? And we can see the impact. So I'm paying now $78 a paycheck. We are doing the math, that's $156 a month. So that's absolutely going to affect my net monthly take home, right? I'm at just over $3,300 a month and around $40,000 net annual, right? So it's just numbers, it's great math. But when we come back together and say, so how much does it really cost me a year? $1,872 a year, just in extra taxes would be out of your pocketbook, right? So there's one last way that you could take some of the state income tax material and hopefully apply it to some decisions your students may be making in the future. Oregon may be a better bet for you if you are somewhere down to the southern border, Canada, who knows? Or students might just want to look and see where, dream job, LA, Miami, you can compare different places and see what it would really cost you to live there. All right, and with that kind of wraps up our presentation for today. Before we get to our closing, just want to let you guys know next week in our second tax webinar, we're going to talk about federal income taxes. Next week, we're going to go through a couple lessons on reading your paycheck, understanding what those FICO deductions are. And I'm going to be joined by Milady Garcia, who is our special populations program supervisor. She's going to talk about some of our students who are already earning income, a lot of our students who are already working, and how this information can be particularly beneficial for families and communities that have a lot of newcomers to our country as well. We also have QR codes here if you want to sign up for our newsletter or our book of the month. Once again, I want to say thank you so much to Bobby for joining us. I will make sure that I spell your name correctly next time. If you joined us late, please do sign in with your name or school or district in the chat. You will be getting an email from us in the week ahead. I think that's a rough, in the next week or so with the survey. And we always appreciate your feedback And again, we'll make sure you have this presentation. And if, thank you so much, Tracy. And if you need any of these resources right away, just let me know. We can make sure you get that PDF copy. I can actually upload that into the chat if I need to. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much. It is 5:30. We want to make sure we respect your time. But thank you so much for being here. Like Bobby said, thank you, especially if you're on spring break. But regardless, thank you for spending an hour and a half with me, and Bobby and Linda and the rest of the FEPP team. And yes, thank you so much. We hope you learned something and feel more confident and excited to bring this information to your students. So thank you so much. If you have any questions, we'll be around for a couple minutes. If not, feel free to head out and we'll go ahead and stop the recording, Linda. Awesome. Thank you.